The 24th of October, 1944, Formosa Strait. The night lay heavy over the water, a suffocating darkness broken only by the fractured gleam of a thin crescent moon drifting between ragged Pacific clouds. USS Tang cut through the black chop like a steel shadow, her bridge slick with spray, the echo of diesel engines throbbing through the hull. Richard O'Kane stood at the center of it all, his silhouette rigid against the wind, eyes fixed on the path of the last torpedo they had fired, a weapon meant to finish a crippled freighter limping desperately toward the distant shoreline. The sea smelled of oil and storm. The air vibrated with the tension of men who had been fighting for 30 hours without rest. Beneath O'Kane, the submarine trembled with every surge of the tide, as though it sensed something the crew did not yet understand. Around him, sailors whispered terse range reports, their voices low, fists tightening on cold metal rails. It was supposed to be another precise strike, one more clean kill in a patrol already burning its way into naval history. But then O'Kane saw it, a flicker, nothing more than a glint on the surface, but it froze the breath in his chest. The torpedo wake, instead of stretching outward in a straight white line, hesitated, curved, as though the weapon had paused mid-course to reconsider its prey. The rippling trail shifted again, turning in an impossibly smooth arc, gliding back toward the submarine like a predator that had suddenly remembered its birthplace. O'Kane leaned forward, his breath sharp. His mind refused what his eyes were telling him, yet the truth revealed itself in the moonlit spray. The Mark 18 was malfunctioning. The torpedo was circling, coming home. A coldness flooded the bridge, a silent paralysis sweeping through the men as they followed the changing wake with widening eyes. Someone muttered a curse. Another gripped the ladder so tightly that blood drained from his knuckles. No one moved. No one dared speak above a whisper. The Pacific wind howled across the bridge, carrying with it the metallic scent of death. O'Kane snapped into action, barking for emergency maneuvers, but the turning circle was already tightening, the torpedo's phosphorescent trail now a glowing loop in the water. The seconds stretched like wire drawn to breaking, every heartbeat a hammer against the ribs. The submarine began to swing hard to starboard, engines roaring, but the weapon had already chosen its path. The returning wake shimmered closer and closer, slicing toward the hull with mechanical inevitability. The men stood transfixed, caught between disbelief and terror, watching the nightmare they had trained for but never imagined would truly come. The sea whispered against the steel plates as though preparing to swallow them whole. And in that final instant, as the glowing arc closed to within yards of Tang's stern, Richard O'Kane understood that the night was no longer an ally, no longer a shield. It had become a witness, silent, merciless, to the moment fate reached out from the water's depths. The torpedo was coming back, and nothing could stop what happened next.
Richard O'Kane's story did not begin in the thunder of torpedoes or the heat of Pacific combat, but in the quiet discipline of a young man shaped by a country preparing for a war it could not yet see. Born in Dover, New Hampshire, he grew up near the cold Atlantic winds that swept across the harbors and fishing docks, where the salt in the air carried the sound of ship horns and the distant promise of horizons he longed to chase. At the Naval Academy, he was not the loudest nor the boldest, but there was a sharpened clarity in his gaze, a kind of inner tension that made instructors note him as a man who would one day hold lives in his hands. He had the manner of someone who listened more than he spoke, who analyzed rather than reacted, who carried an instinctive precision that set him apart from the swaggering cadets dreaming of battleships and carrier decks. O'Kane gravitated toward the submarine force at a time when the silent service was still regarded as an obscure, almost monastic corner of the fleet. Something in him responded to the submerged world, its pressure, its darkness, its demand for absolute control over fear. behind his calm appearance lived a relentless need for mastery. His first assignments were routine: watch duties, engineering boards, long hours learning the behavior of engines, valves, and men. He absorbed every detail: how steel vibrated under stress, how crew morale shifted during long patrols, how instincts sharpened in the cramped heat of a control room. Yet it was not until he was assigned to the USS Wahoo that the shape of his destiny crystallized. There, under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, O'Kane encountered a commander unlike any he had known. Morton possessed a forceful charisma, a readiness to break the conservative doctrines strangling the submarine force in the early war. He did not believe in timid long-range torpedo shots or cautious patrols. He believed in aggression, controlled, calculated, devastating. And in O'Kane he found a perfect counterpart, a man who could execute boldness with flawless precision. Their partnership became legendary. Morton trusted O'Kane with the periscope and the attack solutions, something no captain offered lightly. The two men developed a battlefield language of glances and gestures, a seamless rhythm of decision-making that turned Wahoo into the most feared submarine in the Pacific for a time. Wahoo's patrols were a storm, convoys shattered at point-blank range, destroyers crippled by daring nighttime attacks, and Japanese commanders suddenly forced to confront a new kind of enemy. Through it all, O'Kane's character hardened into something unshakable. He learned to suppress doubt, to think faster than fear, to accept that leadership meant living with the weight of men whose lives depended on his calculations. He learned how fragile a steel hull became when crushed by depth charges, how silence could feel like a blade at the throat, how quickly triumph could twist into catastrophe. But the real moment that carved itself into him came later, when Wahoo sailed on her final patrol without him. O'Kane had been left ashore to train new crews, an assignment he accepted dutifully, unaware it would save his life. When Wahoo vanished in the Formosa Strait, swallowed by the sea without a trace, O'Kane carried the news like a wound that would never close. Morton was gone. The crew he had served beside was gone. The war left no room for mourning, only a silent vow that everything he had learned aboard Wahoo would not die with her. And so the man who emerged from that loss was different, sharper, colder, driven by a quiet fire. O'Kane was no longer merely a promising officer. He was the heir to Morton's doctrine, ready to forge a legacy that would eclipse his mentors. And soon the Navy would hand him the weapon that would make it possible.
The first time Richard O'Kane stood beside Dudley Morton inside the dim glow of Wahoo's conning tower during an attack run, he understood that he had stepped into a new universe of war, one where hesitation was death, where silence thundered louder than gunfire, and where the ocean itself seemed to hold its breath as torpedoes carved their invisible paths. Morton commanded with a presence that filled every rivet of the submarine, and O'Kane absorbed every motion, every choice, every instinct as though learning the language of survival written in steel and adrenaline. The Wahoo did not behave like other American submarines. While many commanders clung to outdated doctrines, insisting on long-distance attacks, Morton pushed his boat straight into the heart of convoy formations, slicing between merchant hulls and destroyer escorts with a confidence that bordered on the reckless. It was O'Kane who translated that recklessness into precision. The man at the periscope, cool-eyed and methodical, calculating angles and speeds with lightning clarity while depth charges rolled into the sea around them like steel thunder. By the time Wahoo reached her second and third patrols, she had become a scourge whispered about in Japanese dispatches. They struck convoys in daylight, surfacing between ships where no American submarine was expected to appear. They slipped into guarded harbors, torpedoes firing so close that the explosion washed spray across the submarine's bow. Morton's boldness shaped the tempo, but it was O'Kane who synchronized the chaos, calling shots with the calmness of a surgeon carving through bone. One night off the coast of New Guinea, Wahoo faced a destroyer charging toward her at full speed, its searchlight slicing the waves. Instead of diving deep and fleeing, Morton ordered a point-blank shot from the surface. O'Kane did not flinch. He took the periscope, whispered the bearing, calculated the closing distance, and released the torpedo at a range so intimate that the destroyer's crew could have seen the wake with their own eyes. Seconds later, the explosion lit the night like a flare signaling judgment. Morton slapped O'Kane on the back, laughing with the thrill of survival. O'Kane only nodded, his mind already shifting to the next threat, the next calculation, the next narrow thread between life and annihilation. But triumph carried a shadow. On every patrol, O'Kane watched men pushed beyond the limits of endurance, faces drawn from nights spent submerged under relentless depth charging. He saw torpedoes fail, heard the hull groan like a living creature under pressure, felt the thudding heartbeat of a submarine hunted by enemies who were learning, adapting, growing more desperate. The ocean offered no mercy, only the promise that a single mistake would be enough to end them. Yet, it was the final patrol of Wahoo that carved the deepest wound. When the submarine departed without him, left ashore to pass on the lessons he and Morton had forged through fire, he expected to hear her triumphant return within weeks. Instead, silence settled like a shroud. Reports trickled in, a sinking in the Formosa Strait, Japanese shore batteries firing on a submarine believed to be Wahoo, oil slicks drifting across the current. Confirmation never came. Only the dreadful certainty that Morton and the entire crew had vanished into the steel coffin of the deep. O'Kane carried the loss in the quietest part of his soul. It was not grief alone. It was inheritance. Wahoo's lessons, paid for in courage and blood, now belonged to him entirely. He would not let them fade. He would refine them, sharpen them, transform them into something even deadlier. And when the Navy handed him command of a new submarine, he would build a weapon worthy of the ghosts he carried.
When Richard O'Kane first walked through the narrow passageways of the newly completed USS Tang, the submarine still smelled of fresh paint, warm steel, and electrical insulation, not yet marked by the fatigue, sweat, and urgency that would soon saturate every bolt. The boat gleamed with the precision of a weapon forged at the exact moment the Pacific War needed it most. Yet Tang was not truly a masterpiece until O'Kane shaped her, for the steel alone meant nothing without the mind and discipline that would command it. He approached his new command with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every system, every valve, every torpedo tube had to respond like an extension of his nerves. He inspected compartments not with the eyes of an officer, but with the scrutiny of a craftsman shaping a blade. He watched his sailors with equal focus, measuring how they moved, how they breathed in stressful drills, how they reacted when orders came faster than thought. He understood that a submarine was only as strong as the men who lived inside its metal confines, and so he began to weave them into a single organism capable of operating with impossible speed. His training regimen was unlike anything practiced in the submarine force. He drilled the crew relentlessly in periscope discipline, rapid observations timed to the second, calculating bearings and speed with such efficiency that solutions formed almost before the periscope dipped beneath the waves. He taught them instinctive coordination, the ability to strike from the surface at night, closing within yards of enemy hulls without hesitation. Failure during these drills was not punished with anger, but with repetition.
the kind that burned muscle memory into reflex. Soon, even the newest sailor could anticipate O'Kane's commands before he spoke them. He instilled absolute trust, not only between officer and man, but among every member of the crew. Each sailor learned his role so deeply that during a battle they moved as though driven by a shared consciousness. No one questioned, no one faltered. They believed in O'Kane's judgment with the kind of faith usually reserved for mythic heroes, and he carried that responsibility with a cold, steady resolve. The periscope became his eye, the engines his lungs, the torpedo tubes the fists of a boxer trained never to miss a strike. Tang's early shakedown exercises shocked the instructors observing from the support vessels. Maneuvers that required minutes on other submarines were executed in seconds. Attack runs practiced at twilight sliced through the sea with a fluency that made the boat feel alive. Torpedoes left the tubes in rapid salvos, each solution faster and more precise than doctrine claimed possible. In simulation after simulation, Tang delivered death before an enemy could even lift binoculars. What emerged from these months of shaping was not just a crew, it was a weapon with one mind, built on the foundation of Wahoo's lessons, refined by O'Kane's discipline, and sharpened by the relentless urgency of a war still burning across the Pacific. By the time Tang departed for her first patrol, the crew moved through the submarine with the quiet certainty of warriors carrying ancient knowledge. Their confidence was not arrogance, but the hard steel of preparation. They knew what they were capable of. They knew their commander would lead them into places where no hesitation could exist. They knew they were serving on a submarine unlike any other American vessel afloat. And as the Pacific opened before them, O'Kane felt the unmistakable pull of destiny. His moment had come, and Tang was ready to carve its name into the very bones of the war.
By the time USS Tang slipped into the waters of her first war patrol, she no longer felt like a machine, but a living presence that moved with the coiled confidence of a predator. Richard O'Kane stood at her center, calm, sharp, relentless, guiding her through seas heavy with enemy shipping, where every hunt tested the bond he had forged with his crew. The war in the Pacific had entered its most brutal stage, and Tang, small in size but immense in precision, became a blade slicing through the Empire's supply lines. Night after night, O'Kane led the submarine into the dark folds of convoys, sometimes surfacing so close to Japanese merchant ships that the crews aboard them could be heard shouting orders in panic. In those moments, the Pacific wind became thick with the smell of burning oil, powder smoke, and the thunder of collapsing steel. O'Kane's eyes, pressed against the periscope or focused from the open bridge, read the chaos like a mathematician solving a violent equation. His commands flowed not with excitement, but with cold certainty. Left full rudder, set depth 3 feet, fire 1, fire 2. Torpedoes streaked into silhouettes spread across the waves like shadows cast by a dying empire. Ship after ship erupted under his precision, each explosion reflecting in the submarine's wake as Tang maneuvered for yet another strike. Her crew barely slept, barely spoke outside essential communication, living inside the steady rhythm of the hunt. With each success, O'Kane's legend grew, not from bravado, but from the unnerving calm he maintained while guiding them through situations where any misstep would have ended them all. During her second and third patrols, Tang became something the Japanese Navy struggled to understand, a submarine that defied conventional tactics. She attacked at night on the surface, charging through convoys like a fast-moving dagger, firing at ranges other commanders believed suicidal. Destroyers circled, searchlights raked the water, depth charges thundered down in desperate patterns, but Tang always slipped away, vanishing into black water seconds before retaliation arrived. On one haunting night, she rescued American airmen clinging to debris under enemy fire,
surfacing into a rain of bullets simply because O'Kane refused to leave them behind. The crew hauled the injured men aboard, while tracers stitched the waves around them, the deck slick with spray and the raw fear of exposure. Yet, once again, O'Kane outmaneuvered the enemy, diving into darkness and carrying the rescued pilots to safety. Word of the deed spread through the fleet, adding a new layer to his already formidable reputation. By the time of her fifth patrol, the strain of relentless victory had carved lines into O'Kane's face. His eyes remained bright, but there was a weight behind them. The knowledge that he had pushed luck, skill, and steel to the breaking point. Tang had already become the most successful American submarine in terms of ships sunk per patrol. Now she prowled the Formosa Strait, a region filled with desperate Japanese convoys trying to ferry troops and supplies to a crumbling front. The fifth patrol would become the most spectacular of all. Convoy after convoy fell under Tang's torpedoes. One night, in waters lit only by exploding cargo ships, O'Kane maneuvered so close to a ferning freighter that flames reflected across the submarine's wet deck. His voice, steady as always, cut through the tower. "Stand by! Fire!" Another explosion split the sea open. It was a crescendo of triumph, victory coming so quickly and so often that the crew felt suspended between elation and exhaustion. O'Kane pushed them forward, chasing every contact, every radar echo, determined to cut as deeply as he could before fate demanded its price. And fate was waiting. For as the fifth patrol reached its soaring peak, the torpedo that would end everything was about to leave the tube.
The moment the circling torpedo struck Tang, the night split open with a violent flash that seemed to swallow the entire submarine in a single breath. The blast erupted beneath the stern with a force that tore steel like wet paper, hurling men to the deck and plunging the forward compartments into darkness. Richard O'Kane felt the world lurch sideways, the bridge pitching as if the sea had suddenly risen to rip the submarine from beneath him. Screams, metal shrieking, the gut-wrenching roar of water flooding into ruptured bulkheads. These sounds fused into a single deafening reality. Tang was dying. The submarine began to sink stern first, the bow pointing toward the stars as the ocean yanked her under. O'Kane and the bridge crew were thrown into the black water, the shock so cold it stole breath and reason. Around them, burning oil spread across the waves, the glow of the explosion illuminating desperate faces and twisted debris. Men gasped as the suction of the descending hull tugged them downward, dragging them toward the vortex of a steel tomb. Some fought free, others vanished beneath the boiling surface. Below, in the forward torpedo room, a handful of survivors clung to consciousness as seawater surged around the hissing pipes and flickering emergency lights. These men were trapped inside the submarine, now lying on the ocean floor, the pressure groaning against the hull like a beast clawing to break in. In the darkness, they made a decision few humans would ever face. Attempt a blind, near-suicidal ascent from the depths, using escape equipment that had never before been tried in such conditions. They prepared the trunk, equalized pressure, and one by one stepped into the blackness of the Pacific, carried upward in a silence filled with terror and faith. Miraculously, some survived the ascent, bursting through the surface hours after O'Kane, dazed and shivering under the gray morning sky. Rescue did not come. Japanese patrols combed the strait, dragging the wounded Americans from the water with rifle butts and shouted orders. O'Kane, half-conscious and barely able to stand, was forced into custody, beginning a journey through a labyrinth of camps where humanity had long since eroded under the weight of war. He was taken to Ofuna, the secret interrogation center where beatings were routine and where starvation and isolation stripped men to shadows of themselves. His crew, those few who survived, were scattered among prisons where disease, cruelty, and hopelessness tightened around them like iron shackles. Yet O'Kane endured.
Through interrogations, humiliation, and the slow passage of months defined by hunger and fever, he remained a commander, even in captivity, carrying the responsibility of the men around him. He was moved again to Omori, where the war's final chapter approached, and the camp grew restless under the distant thunder of American bombers carving Japan's defeat into the sky. When liberation finally came, O'Kane emerged shockingly thin, but his gaze was unbroken. The survivors, only 9 men from the most successful submarine crew in American history, stood beside him as the Navy honored their courage. For his actions, for his leadership, for the unyielding brilliance that had made Tang a legend, Richard O'Kane received the Medal of Honor. His doctrine, aggressive, precise, fearless, became the backbone of post-war submarine training. His methods reshaped how the silent service would think, fight, and command for generations. The wreck of Tang remained on the seafloor, a broken monument to the thin line between genius and tragedy. But the legacy of the boat, its unmatched success, its daring patrols, its crew who fought with a unity rare in war, lived on in every classroom where O'Kane taught the art of command, in every submarine that sailed under doctrines born from his mind, and in every quiet moment where the ocean whispered its stories to those willing to hear. The Pacific had claimed the boat, but it could not claim the legend. For some vessels die in darkness, yet their names burn forever in the history they helped forge.